Welcome to this episode of Pipeline Things. Again, I feel like every episode continues to get better. Thank you for the feedback on the audio issues. Miss Producer has continued to set the standard and improve there. This issue, we introduce another guest, the hyphen. We leave you asking, do you have a dirt merchant working on your pipelines? And if not, why? No, but seriously, we get into issues around geohazards. Specifically, why is it that geohazards find operators rather than operators find the geohazards? In addition to that, Chris changes his name to Thing 20 Fun. You can be the judge of whether or not that makes sense or not. Come take a little ride with us. We have some fun. We learn a lot about geohazards, and we appreciate your support of the show. All right, welcome to this Wednesday's episode of Pipeline Things. I am your host, Thing 20, otherwise known as Rhett Dotson. Not greater in prominence, but greater in stature than my co-host, Thing 21, Mr. Christopher DeLeon.
21, let's be clear, 20 fun.
And is everyone,
maybe 20 fun
goes,
I love that, so 20 good. Fun. You're 20, I'm 20 fun.
I feel like you just co-opted an opportunity from me that I didn't see coming. Well done, that was a good shot.
20 fun.
Wow. Well, me and 20 Fun are coming to you today from the Met Lab here at ADV Integrity. As you'll notice, we're going to be bouncing around if you're a viewer and you're watching online. We're going to be bouncing around between various places. And you'll notice again on this episode, there is a third empty chair between Christopher and I. So more fun to come. I don't want to get there yet, but I always like to open up, Chris, and just ask, man, how are you doing? What's going on in life?
You know, springtime's around the corner. Looking forward to spring break this year. We're not going anywhere. So again, back to my love for the rodeo season, we will be spending a couple of days at the rodeo with the kiddos. So they have a great carnival. Get the carnival fun packs before it starts, 50% off if you can.
Are you selling carnival? Are you selling rodeo stuff on the show?
I am not. I don't.
This is not a free rodeo marketing thing.
Look, if you're even around Houston, you need to come to Houston Livestock Show.
It's actually true. It's good.
It's fantastic. All the fried food is amazing. But what about you?
You can get everything fried. You know,
I think what
my spring break shapes up like is we have to get the yard in shape. I'm one of the few people out there who still cuts my own grass. Mainly because I want my son to have to grow up and do it. It's something like, you know, I suffered through it, so I feel like he needs to suffer through it. And in getting the yard ready, Chris, it's amazing, right? You go through the winter, I go to the spring, and I'm like, there's a hole in my backyard. I'm like, how does a hole open up in my backyard? Or the ground was not this uneven last year, and I'm trying to ride over the mower, and I'm like, and I'm bouncing around all over in the mower, and I'm like, what's going on? Like, it's flat.
I can relate.
You can relate?
I wake up sometimes and I go out and just do a nice little walk in the backyard and I have all these little holes. Yeah, I have all these little holes. And what is it? Armadillos. I have an armadillo problem, really. And so, you got to be careful with them. They're hazardous.
I didn't know.
It's a great way to get leprosy.
I have armadillos, but I know my dad did. He caught like 15 of them underneath his deck in Magnolia. You know, but it always makes me worried about like foundation issues on my house. Because did you ever own a house that had foundation issues?
Thanks to God, not yet.
So like I go out and I have a house, like the door in the garage likes to stick, and the kids are like, "Dad, the door's locked." I'm like, "The door's not locked. You just need to put your shoulder into it to get it to open." And I feel like, why is the soil always moving in Houston?
The rain. The rain.
Yeah, but it's flat, right? Like you feel like shit, but it's clay. I get it. I know. Look, I had one geotechnical course in college, and all I learned is to be afraid of dirt. We called it like fear of dirt. That was the label of the course. And it's funny, now that I'm in the pipeline industry, people are like, it doesn't matter which job I've had. When I worked at my first consulting gig, they were like, "Oh, you're civil. We have this problem about dirt. Can you help us?" And I'm like, "What? No." Then I go to Rose, and they're like, "Oh, you are civil. You must know something about pipelines and pipe soil interaction." And I'm like, well, I mean, because of the exposure I've got. But the truth is, it's amazing to me how much the soil everywhere moves, right? And we know that has an influence on our pipelines.
And the integrity of our pipelines.
Which brings us to our special guest today. Because people like to think I'm an expert, and I know a little bit about pipe soil interaction, but not as much as the guy that's going to talk about it today, nor do I have as much experience. So I think it's time to bring on our guest, who is... You want to introduce him or me?
No, you do.
I got it? Yeah. Mr. Alex Mckenzie-Johnson is going to be joining us today. Alex, come on. This is your chair here in the middle. And so, as Thing 20, I'll shake your hand too. So, Alex Mckenzie-Johnson is going to introduce himself, but comes to us from GeoSyntech. We've been close friends actually for a while now. I met him when I was at my former employer, probably 5 or 6 years ago. But Alex, tell us a little bit. Tell the audience, who is Alex? Who did we bring on the show today? What mistake did we make?
Well, first off, Red, this is a great segue. You definitely need a geologist, and I am a
at
geologist.
My house?
So yep. when you want to look at homes, geologist, good idea. But yeah,
Wait, aren't those rock jocks?
Geologist?
I thought those were rock jocks, not realtors.
Well, I kind of call myself a dirt merchant. Most of what I'm doing is, dealing with dirt.
A dirt merchant.
And that's been pretty much my career for the last 20 plus years.
I'm gonna write that one down. A dirt merchant.
Dirt merchant. That is gonna work. Next time somebody calls me, they tell me they've got a pipe soil interaction or a landslide problem. I'm gonna be like, have you talked to a dirt merchant?
That's what we do, a lot of it. So I got into geology in college. I was actually a political science major and thought I was going to do like politics or law, and I took a Rocks for Jocks Geology 101 course, and I loved it, and I switched my major to that, and I kind of figured the career stuff would work out, and it did. And then when I went and got my master's, I worked on a big, huge, deep-seated landslide project. I mean, it's just muddy and uneven, but super fun to map it out, and I got really lucky, and that's kind of where my career revolved around landslides, and then pipelines came into the mix, and been doing that, and I took a little bit of a segue from consulting to go work for Kinder Morgan. Okay. For about a little over 4.5 years.
And that's where I met you, right?
Yep.
I met you when you were at Kinder Morgan.
Yep. So at the time, I was doing a lot of consulting for Kinder Morgan. They'd had a landslide power program.
If you're in the audience and you're wondering, Chris just dropped his phone. I don't know what that probably comes through like a gunshot. Hand grenade on the show, but that was Chris's phone before.
So, and kind of, going into the topic of the show, Kinder Morgan had a landslide caused rupture in Ohio, and I was doing a lot of work for them at the time, and they said, we need to have a formal in-house geohazard program, and asked me if I wanted to set it up. So I packed the family from Seattle, which is where I was living at the time, and moved to Texas. And
for the topography, right? And the weather?
It's a little flatter, a little hotter here, but otherwise it's just like Seattle.
Just like Seattle.
So I have to ask. So how did your wife convince you to hyphenate your name with her last name? Because I see it's Mckenzie-Johnson.
Yeah, that's
wow.
So I know this is a very relevant topic for our
and
he's
young
now
female wondering whether he came on the correct show or not.
Well, no, it's not quite that. It's a common mistake. Over the years, I've been called Ms. Mckenzie-Johnson, and I get people all the time because they see that hyphenated name. But the real story, it was the 70s. My parents were kind of hippies, and my mom kept her name, and obviously my dad had his name. And when my sister and I were born, they said, well, we'll just kind of hyphenate their names. It's what the English do, right? All the fancy people.
The Mexicans too. They just don't use the hyphen.
Yeah.
Okay, so this makes sense. I get it.
Okay.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. Then a few years later, they got divorced, and and I was like, well, this hyphenated name is kind of a pain, but if I pick one, I'm picking mom or I'm picking dad, so I got to keep both of them. So
that would be.
That's
awesome.
why I'm still hyphenated.
So did your wife hyphenate her name?
No, she has this completely separate name, which makes it even more fun for our kids.
So since we're going to go here is we've had, again, I do want to, you made the right choice. Futch said that before the show he had a career, and then after the show there was an upward trajectory to his career. We're confident you will experience the same boom here, right? It's before and after, and we have the Futch factor, and now we have the hyphen dirt merchant. Is that what
hyphenated dirt merchant.
No, hyphen dirt merchant.
I think I'm going to put out new business cards with that on it now.
We can help you with that.
That would be great, right? Instead of whatever your professional title is, it's AKA dirt merchant. He's Thing 20, I'm Thing 20 fun.
And today we have the dirt merchant. Okay. Bringing it back around for the audience, right? So I really like you have operator experience and consulting experience. That is a unique combination, a very powerful combination in our industry. We like to run through. So tell me, you've seen more than landslides, I'm hoping, in terms of threats on pipelines. Or have you only dealt with landslides?
Well, the majority of my career has been around landslides. And there's a reason for that, which is that, if you look at geohazard incidents, about 80% are caused by landslides. But we also do stuff like rivers and seismic hazards and other geohazards like that. But if I had to pick one geohazard that I was gonna take care of, it would definitely be landslides.
Well, Chris knows where I'm going. Have you seen bullets in a pipeline? We have to ask everybody on the show this now. The gold standard is whether or not you have seen bullets on a pipeline.
It's pretty hard to see the bullets if you're being shot at, right? I mean, you hear it, but you don't see it.
Wait, you've been shot at?
There are some areas where there's a lot of pipelines in more urban areas, inner city, where there's infrastructure. So I could see that.
Yeah, I've definitely had rifles pointed at me. I've had people.
I think that counts.
Yeah. I mean, I've been out working and heard gunshots. And you're like, well, is that someone hunting, or is that someone trying to give me a warning to
private
get
property?
Out?
Trespassing.
we're gonna say that counts. So have you seen the effects of bullets on the pipeline, or maybe personally experienced the close relative of being the result in bullets on the pipeline? We'll go with that.
Yeah, I've never been actually shot, so there's that. So
that's good. Let's keep it that way. As a consultant, that you don't get shot, right? Okay, so let's bring it into the real topic on today's show, which is definitely geohazards. We're going to cover that whole threat and get into it. One of the things that I've said before many times whenever I've talked about geohazards, and I'm curious what your opinions on it would be, is that unfortunately geohazards find operators before operators find the geohazard. And I hope I didn't walk into something, but is that consistent with your experiences? Do you agree with that, or?
Oh, absolutely. Every operator that has a credible geohazard program is the result of a major geohazard incident. And so there's the before period where they weren't really, geohazards weren't really on the radar, and then there's the after period where unfortunately, all of a sudden, they're having to do this huge ramp up and trying very quickly to get caught up on managing geohazards.
So, why does it happen that way? Like, I feel like there's an awareness out there. Almost every conference I go to has a geohazard track now.
Yep.
We've been talking about it actively, honestly, for about the last decade. I'd say it's really picked up. Why do you think that's the case, Alex? Do you have an opinion on it?
Yeah, I do actually. The last decade, that's a really good timeline. I think because kind of prior to about 2010, there was this idea that geohazards were a force majeure type of event, an act of nature, right? Like you can't stop Mother Nature. Something just happens. Exactly. Something happens, you just got to get the line back in service, right? But because of a combination of new technologies and I'd say a general societal regulatory shift, geohazards have achieved there's a lot more awareness around them, right? The idea that they just happen is no longer considered acceptable in terms of integrity management.
Do you think it's let's go on this track of assuming that a lot of the robust geohazards plans are a result of failures. Do you feel like there's enough of an awareness now, or there's still a general lack of awareness of what you just said? Because I think that's important, right? Earlier you said the majority of incidents related to geohazards are landslides, about 80%, right? So that's pretty significant. So you have something you can focus in on, landslides, right? And you say that post 2010, so we're talking near 12 years now. So I mean, that's a long time. Do you feel like the awareness is out there at least that this is a legitimate, credible threat that needs to be incorporated into plans, that needs to be monitored, assessed, and managed?
Absolutely. And, like what we did at Kinder Morgan is we did that, right? We, in the span of about 3 years, we assessed and managed landslides for the entire natural gas system for Kinder Morgan, which is about 65,000 miles of pipeline. So I think it's really, it needs to be part of integrity management plans going forward. If it's not part of it right now, it needs to be.
So let's lean into that integrity management component a bit. So if we look at general regulations, there's a little bit more of an element of a performance nature to it.
Yep. Not
entirely, but you're beginning to see sprinkles of it, is what I like to say. But there's still this heavy prescriptive component to it. Talk to us a little bit what you think about how regs maybe are encouraging or maybe lacking a bit in the encouraging side to addressing geohazards within integrity management.
Yeah, I think the regulations, particularly historically, although it's starting to shift, have been really kind of light on geohazards, and it's understood that operators are supposed to manage they're threats, but a lot of the other hazards like corrosion or some of the other main integrity hazards, it's very prescriptive what the operators are expected to do. And because of that, a lot of integrity programs are structured around those prescriptive requirements, where the performance-based requirements are left much more vague, and they haven't received the same kind of attention.
So the prescriptive nature makes me think of a little bit kind of like a how-to, right? Not entirely, right? Because engineers, we like to operate in the gray or make gray and then operate in it. So, it's pretty clear to say, hey, for corrosion, you'll do ECDA, ICDA, or PIG or hydro test, right? Yep. Whereas, so that's kind of like a how-to. An operator can lean into that.
Yep.
If it's lighter on the geohazard side, any tips or external references that operators can lean into? Go to Google and say, here's a great starting point if you're interested in, integrity management of geohazards.
Well, I mean, not to pitch my own documents too much, but a couple years ago, I was the lead author on a document for INGA called the Guidelines for Management of Landslide Hazards for Pipelines, which does lay out the elements, particularly around landslides, but many of the same aspects can be applied to other hazards as well, right? So it lays out the overall structure to do that.
I think that's great.
Yeah, so I, in my personal experiences on the regs, right, is I feel like when you look at pre-updated gas rule, they were almost silent. I think the updated gas rule is really the first time that we see weather and outside forces, or WAF, is what a lot of people are using. Does that not, you don't like WAF?
Don't WAF it up.
I don't know if that's what they intended.
You WAF that one.
Oh, okay. That's the first time you really see the regs actually mentioning specifically operators have some requirements with regards to weather and outside forces. And they mention it, and they actually open the door to the use of inline inspection, specifically IMU-based tools and caliper-based tools in the assistance of managing that threat. And I think that's big. I think we're seeing an awareness. I think we say 10 years, but I think the reality is 10 years isn't all that long in pipeline life. Yep. Let's be real, right? I mean, we've only really, the advent of IMPs began in 2001, 2, 3, and corrosion management via ILI, going back to the 70s as we've talked about. So 10 years is not all that long, especially in the span of pipelines that have been around since the 50s. But before we get into that, I do want to dive into that. I want to talk a little more about your experiences on specific geohazards and maybe why operators aren't always aware of that threat. But before we do, Ms. Producer's signaling that we need to take a break, so we're going to take a short break and come right back.
Hi, my name is Chris Alexander, and I'm president and founder of ADV Integrity, and we are the proud sponsors of the Pipeline Things podcast led by Rhett Dotson and Christopher DeLeon. In that podcast, they're going to be talking about things like integrity management, pretty much anything related to pipelines, including regulations, technology, and anything that you would need to know. They're also going to be talking about current events. For those of you that don't know anything about ADV Integrity, we're a consulting company. We do full-scale testing. I'm actually here in the lab, and really high-end engineering to serve the pipeline industry. And we would love to hear from you, and really excited about being sponsors of the Pipeline Things podcast.
All right, welcome back. Thanks, me and Thing 20 Fun here with the hyphenated dirt merchant. So in the first part of this series, or this episode, we really, Alex laid out for us the fact that, again, it really seems to be consistent that geohazards tend to find operators before operators find geohazards. And we talked a lot about the influence of regulations, or maybe some of the silence of regulations on that point. What I want to do is I want to pick up when an operator hits a geohazard, oftentimes it surprises them. And I think a lot of the feedback I get on why operators aren't building robust geohazard programs, just to be honest, is they're like, Rhett, all of my lines are in West Texas. I don't know if you've been out there, but it's flatter than Houston. Or Rhett, I've been managing this pipeline for 70 years. I've never had a geohazard event at all. When you and I talk, can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, what would you respond to an operator who tells you something like that?
I've worked on several landslide caused ruptures. So those pipes have been built in the 50s or 60s, and then the rupture didn't happen until the 2010s, right? And so just because something's been there a long time, no guarantee that there aren't geohazards that could be affecting.
So absence of failure does not constitute success.
Exactly. And one of the reasons that, and one of the things that's kind of a paradox is that when we think of a landslide, we tend to think of something we see on the 5 o'clock news, right? Like an entire mountainside just suddenly gives way.
California mudslide, homes, the whole thing going down.
Exactly. But there's a lot of parts of the country where these things, it's moving ground, kind of like you're talking about your house, right? It's moving ground, and that movement is really slow. You know, maybe you're talking like a foot or two or even inches a year, and you can imagine that pipe sitting there for 60, 70 years, and that movement, that ground is moving. It's not obvious at all, and then finally you get to that point where
well, it's funny, you say it's not obvious, but then the accumulation has got to be somewhat obvious, does it? Or am I wrong in that? I mean, 1 to 2 inches a year over 60 years, that would come up to 120 inches, that's 10 foot. That's no longer a small event.
Right. And then I think that kind of segues into some of the big changes that have happened in the last 10 years. One of the big ones has been the advent of using the IMU tool for bending strain analysis, right? And so that's a really powerful tool for picking up those kind of slow, progressive movements that are affecting the pipes. The other one is the advent of LiDAR technology, and that's a laser surveying technique, which in essence allows you to kind of strip off all the overlying vegetation. And you can see these landslide features that a lot of times you can't even see it when you're walking around on the ground, but you can see it from the LiDAR. So those two tools, the LiDAR, IMU bending strain, allow you both to identify where those landslides are at and if it's already affected a pipeline and about how much that effect has been.
Yeah, let's go back to the obvious component of this, right? Let's talk about when you're on site. Can you give us an example of where to the untrained eye maybe it wasn't obvious, right? Because we know our operators are prudent and they're walking the right way.
Yep.
Right. Does it become obvious if you're trained, or even when you're trained and you're walking the right way, it can still be pretty difficult to identify some of these hazards?
You know, if you know what you're looking for, you can see it. But a lot of times all it really manifests is kind of uneven ground, and maybe there's some small cracks that start to appear, some trees that start to kind of lean over. But a lot of times you've got this kind of narrow focus on the right of way, and you're looking at features that extend well outside of the right of way. So it's hard to see what you're looking at. Right?
It sounds like trending is pretty important, right? It's not just like this discrete point of I walked the right of way and I saw this, right?
It was fine today.
Yeah, it's unlikely to detect the hazard if you're just looking at like a snapshot in time, right? That's more difficult than if you're trending it of some sort, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think it's having the context, right? The kind of, if a pipeline patrol, they're flying in a plane, or you've got a guy walking on the right of way, they've got a narrow focus, right? Yeah. And a lot of times as geologists, we're trying to kind of look at the bigger picture, right? So we're trying to look off the right of way. What are we seeing off the right of way? What does the LiDAR tell us? What are other things that are going on? Are there issues where maybe like fence lines are being bent over, offset, right? So you're kind of trying to get all that evidence. It's kind of like a detective story, right? You're trying to get your clues to figure out what's happening.
Do you see, I'm not going to try to go too far on a tangent, but I'm just curious because we don't know what we don't know, right? We see Esri as an example, really leaning in to help, make data available to operators to make decisions, right? And they have tools like Survey 123, right, where they're really trying to connect the guy in the field with somewhere where somebody can do analytics. So I could see whether it's something like Survey 123 or a piece of paper. Do you have any comments around the current practice, not best practice, but practice on whether some of those activities are able to capture some of the things you need to be looking for, or are those still maybe more geared towards encroachment and HCA class type activities?
It's a little tough because if you're talking to a typical operator, the field operations, they've got a lot of responsibilities.
Yeah.
It's not realistic to say we're going to make someone into a geologist. And so they can capture stuff that's really obvious, but you need to have that professional look at that system because all it takes is just the one site that you overlook, right? And so that's where having that comprehensive look at an entire pipeline system is so valuable, because then you're operating from a position of knowledge rather than waiting for the incident to catch you. You're catching it before it happens to you.
So I want to touch on the two tools you mentioned, right? Because I think we might have glossed over those, and there's a lot of people, including my mom, that might be in the audience that don't know what IMU and LiDAR are. right? And so I just want to get, layman's terms, or WAF, right? But we had weather and outside forces, WAF, not waffle.
I just thought of something. The next time you go on site and you see a legitimate geohazard, you have to say, "What the WAF?"
Wow. Video.
Definitely gonna work.
This is our WAF expert here. So on that though, let's talk. What I really like about the pairing of those is one looks at things outside the pipeline, and one looks at things inside the pipeline, right? So IMU, or inertial measurement unit, is an option that all operators have to incorporate with their ILI tools, right? And I'm going to sit my high horse for a moment. Operators out there, if you're listening to this, if you are running inspection tools and choosing not to include an IMU on board, there's no good reason for doing that. Even if you're not going to do a bending strain assessment today, gather the data so that you have the option in the future. That's my personal recommendation. I think the value in what is being collected by that IMU on board that ILI has potential significant value that's very difficult and can't be gathered historically if you miss it.
And a good point there actually is it doesn't always have to be smart pigs, right? I mean, talk to your service providers, whether it's cleaning pigs or ILI, and ask them what options you have. It's at least that way you know what can be enabled with an IMU and what can't.
Absolutely. The second thing is LiDAR, right? And so LiDAR is typically equipped on an aircraft, right? Goes, it scans. I think it's important because you mentioned that can handle foliage, right? And that can handle right-of-ways that are going to have things on them like tall grass, brush, those types of things. And in my experiences, what has happened sometimes is sinkholes, things like that can be very difficult to determine from a typical aerial inspection because of the foliage. But LiDAR has the ability to see through this, right?
That's absolutely right, and it's been transformative for geology in general, and particularly for pipeline geohazards. Some of the earliest uses of LiDAR to identify fault lines around Seattle that had not previously been identified, and so here's a tool that allows these subtle geologic features to be identified. And it's particularly powerful in areas like the Appalachians, where you have very dense forests. You also have a lot of landslides, Pacific Northwest, areas like that.
So help us understand how to use them, if you can, a little bit, right? Sure. So again, I'm going back to I'm an integrity engineer. I'm responsible for 300 miles of pipe.
Yep.
And you know what? I like the podcast. I'm going to go look at your Inga document.
Yep.
How do I use ILI? How do I use LiDAR?
Well, I think you guys have hit on the ILI, right? You work with your ILI service provider to get that IMU bending strain. LiDAR, I would partner with a geologist or geological engineer. Okay. And there's many companies that collect LiDAR. So you can send it out to bid, and you can usually get a pretty reasonable cost.
So it's accessible. LiDAR is accessible.
It's very accessible, and I think, again, kind of going back to this 2010 timeframe, the cost per mile for LiDAR has significantly decreased. Like, we kind of expect this with technology, right? Like, you look at what a flat screen TV cost 20 years ago.
Plasma.
Versus now, right? It's a lot cheaper. Same thing is true for LiDAR.
So I'm going to go on a limb here, right? And say, if I'm an integrity engineer and I have these two tools, when would I choose LiDAR versus when would I choose ILI? So I'm a hypothesizer a little bit, and you correct.
Yep.
Is it fair to say that it would be really beneficial to have LiDAR as like a baseline to understand what my topography is and what threats I may or may not have?
Yep.
And then part of an integrity plan is then to monitor and assess. So an example of where ILI could fit into that is we use ILI to then get like a more discrete or more pipeline specific, right? So the LiDAR tells me what's around the pipeline, and the ILI gives you what is the pipeline, and now you monitor that asset between both ILI and LiDAR.
What do you say to that? That's spot on, right? Okay. I think the LiDAR gives you the big picture perspective. You can do it for entire pipeline systems and get that really good baseline. The IMU helps you when you know you have some potential issues to assess what's been the effect on the pipeline, and then over time to monitor those effects and see if they worsen.
So I think that's I really like how you said, particularly with regards to ILI, right? So ILI again measures what's happening on the pipeline.
Yep.
And I think the strength of that is that it's not arguable. It's either impacting the pipeline or not, but you don't necessarily know why, which is the real strength behind LiDAR.
Yep.
I think the weakness of using one or the other only is you might have something acting on the pipeline from a bending strain perspective, but not know why. LiDAR, you may have something happening, but not know whether or not it's impacting the pipeline. When you put the two of those together, then I think you start to have the makings of what I'd say is a robust geohazard program. And the frequency of the two of those can often be adjusted independently. That's another strength.
Yep.
And complementary. Absolutely right. So if you're bound by a regulatory inspection interval in IMU because you don't want to put one in the pipeline sooner than that, you're not bound by that with regards to LiDAR.
So I have to ask.
Okay.
I have to ask. I know everyone is asking.
Okay. I'm worried.
Ready? What role does the dirt have? Right? You're a dirt merchant, right? So I've got LiDAR. I understand that what's going on around the pipeline. I've got IMU that tells me what's going on with the pipeline. What role does the dirt have?
Well, I mean, if we're talking geohazards, we're talking about the surface, right? Mm-hmm. So, I'm a geologist, and there's some geologists, and they're looking at structures thousands of feet below the surface, right? You talk to petroleum geologists, they're dealing with really deep. I'm just the very, very tip of the skin of the
epidermis. So
we're not at the dinosaur level yet. That's not where we're
not at dinosaur level. We're just looking at the very, very surface, right there. And so, the soil, the dirt, has a big bearing on what's the effect of the landslide or other geohazard on the pipeline. And now, what's kind of cool though is that interaction is really complex, right? Like if you kind of look at different types of soil and how do they soil and pipe interact, that is a very complex science. But what's really neat about things like LiDAR and IMU bending strain is that to some degree it takes away that complexity, right? Because the LiDAR says, hey, I can see there's a landslide that's here. I don't have to know all the underlying soil properties that cause that landslide to occur in that location.
That is a great point.
And the same thing with the IMU bending strain.
So it becomes scalable. You don't have to understand the dirt in all these circumstances, which can be complex. There's a way to monitor and manage through things that we better understand.
Exactly.
Like LiDAR, topography, right-of-way inspections, and ILAP.
Okay. Yep. So look, we've hit this. I think the audience gets it. LiDAR and IMU are useful many times over. What's the hesitancy, or why don't you see many operators just broadly engaging this?
I think that's a great question. I think a lot of it is change is hard. A lot of the focus on geohazards. We're talking about 2010, but that's pretty recent pipeline integrity program time frames. And a lot of operators haven't had the pain of going through one of these incidents. I can tell you when they do happen, they are tremendously disruptive to the operators.
Pain drives change.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I mean, the environment is also complex, right? You need competent people, so there's a human capital component to it, right? The tolerance for failure is ever increasing. Natural ESG type complications that we have with transition of energy and all, it's a lot as well. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, right? There's only so much we could do. So I think what we've done today though is we've given a great bunch of resources, right, for our operators to say, if I'm not focused on geohazards, I know that I could probably start with landslides.
Yep.
There's some great documents out there that I could start looking into as a reference to start trying to think about where I need to go or where not. And there's readily accessible tools out there, right?
Yeah, that's true. And just to be clear, I don't want to give short shrift to like rivers and seismic hazards and other geohazards. Those are very important to you. But kind of in terms of if you had to start somewhere, I would start with landslides.
Yeah. And I think you hit on it, right? I think there's some new regulation around if there's a WAF event, the significant one, then you're supposed to respond within 72 hours or so. So maybe that's an opportunity to lean in on some of those type waterways and all those areas that you identify through right-of-way management.
Yeah, and I think a lot of operators are trying to figure out what that means. What does it mean if you have a Harvey type event? How do you realistically inspect all those areas within 72 hours? And so there's a lot of interest in things like satellite technologies or drone type technologies or other things that might be able to satisfy that requirement. But I think a lot of operators are trying to wrestle with what does this really mean in practical terms.
I gotta be honest. Have you enjoyed today?
It's been pretty good. Yeah,
It's been pretty good.
Yeah.
That topic in and of itself is probably a whole separate topic. Have we sufficiently entertained you to make you want to come back on and address that separately?
Sure, let's talk about it.
You know, and I want the audience to know I asked those questions in real time. So if Alex would have turned me down, I would have put a real damper on the end of the show. But you know, I want to wrap back up on. I want to start trying to close it up, right? Because you've given some really great guidance today. We talked about the fact that just because you haven't had failures doesn't mean that the potential's not out there. Inga produced a landslide document, or I'm sorry, really a geohazard document, a guidance document that is a great resource for operators. I would definitely encourage you to go seek that out. If you're not looking at IMU and LiDAR on some component of your system, you should begin doing that. If you need help with either of those, I'd say, you know, we like to say on the show, Chris, give us a call, right? If you need help with a bending strain program and getting that analysis started, give me a call. If you need help on looking at your actual pipeline, the dirt, this is the dirt merchant here, Alex. Definitely give the hyphen a call and run down that with him. But the point is there are resources out there to get help with operators on dealing with that. And we would like to encourage them. So you have any final parting thoughts for the audience? You're going to be back, but I hope you're going to be back.
Now you're kind of putting me on the spot here to have to come up with final parting thoughts. But
you don't have to. It can be a parting shot at Christopher as well if you would like.
No, I think the takeaway is it is a manageable hazard. It is something that the technology has evolved greatly. There's expertise that's out there. It's something that it's a lot better to get it done ahead of time, a lot cheaper, a lot less stress. Because it seems like usually these events happen like the Thursday of Thanksgiving, right as you're about to carve the turkey, you get that phone call and says, we've had an incident. Nobody wants to get that phone call, right?
Let's face it, pipeline failures happen on holidays.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up on that point. Again, if you were here today, thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Again, this is the podcast for pipeliners. Everybody you know, my mom especially. Hopefully Alex's mom is listening. If she is, I'm sorry he called you a hippie. I don't think he meant anything bad by it. And we will see you the Wednesday after next. I am your host, Thing 20, Thing 20 Fun, and the Dirt Merchant, Alex Mckenzie-Johnson.